Hey woodworkers, welcome back. Today I'm in the process of making or finishing this little box. So within this I have a liner that's going to go in and help the lid to kind of find where it wants to live. But the challenge today is that I need to create this framework all the way around to separate the lower half to where the lid is. And so in doing this I need to create some miters. So in theory cutting a miter seems pretty simple, right? So we should be able to make this thing fine, and that's great. The problem is if we cut this thing too short, there's obviously going to be a gap, and that's going to look weird from every angle. If it's too long, it's going to start pushing away one of these sections, or if we try to bridge or minimize that on both sides, it starts to create a gap, and we have a gap on the inside as well, which doesn't really work. So I need to cut some miters. Now you might be saying, well, I've been cutting miters for 20 years and I don't have a problem with that. And you're probably right. Where it gets weird is when we're dealing with really thin stock, and so the miter saw would be an option, but miter saw is really tricky if you're cutting the saw here and you're trying to find your angle, and then the bevel and the miter are giving you some feedback on a small piece. Maybe it's not super critical, but there's a bit of a safety issue here in that if that blade is cutting and there's any wiggle at all when you're going through the cut, all it takes is one tooth to grab part of this, usually this outer point right here. If you're looking at the saw as it's cutting, if it grabs here, then it's going to pinch the blade and kick back when it goes up against the fence. It just becomes a bit of a mess, and then you ruin the stock. And so being a little bit more cautious about this, I've created this sled, and this is not novel by any means. This is a fairly typical design for the most part, and an easy way for us to get into cutting miters. So here I'll go through and I'll make my cut in this manner. What is unique possibly is that I have a stop here, and then the stop, because it runs on T-tracks, I can do this on either side. But what I think is helpful is there are times when I'm starting a cut on one leg of this sled. And so what I'll do is I'll make this cut, I'll go through, and then rotating this down, I can adjust this so it stops and engages in wherever this thing needs to be, which is good. If I were to do this in the reverse manner, if I were to start here with a piece that's, I don't know, 3 or 4 feet long or whatever, this fence on the table saw is always going to interfere. So I typically prefer to start to my left and wrapping this thing around, but it doesn't matter. The physics of this does not change. The one thing that I think that is interesting about this is that it's very easy to adjust, and I would argue it's preferable to just clamping a block in this manner here, because the second you take off that clamp, and this piece is going to shift, and even holding it and then clamping, it becomes a two-handed operation, and it's just a little bit clunky. The other thing that I did when I was designing this stop is that I made this adjustable so that this will rotate out of the way, and I'll have full access to this leg should I need to for what I'm doing, and I can take this and put it over here or whatever. But the takeaway is that this this point exactly is what I'm trying to avoid, because sometimes rethreading this T-track nut here is sometimes a little bit tricky. I guess that's technically a bolt. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky, and I didn't want to be able to thread this. I'd like to adjust this without having to kind of read where this stuff is at. Okay, so the other thing that I've done with this project is I've created a little bit of a lip on the piece, and hopefully you can see that. Come on, focus. There's my hands, and yes, that was exactly the same. Hopefully you could see this. No, you can't see it. You can pick up a little bit. There's a little bit of a lip over on the side to the right, where this is going to hook around onto the piece. And so in doing that, that helps me to get this to align so that I have the same projection everywhere. And there's just the tiniest little gap on the inside from where this liner is. And I'm talking about tiny, but just a little sliver, and that way I'm not going to rest this inside edge up against this liner. I'm going to butt this up against the piece, and if there's any irregularity on the edge of this piece, this will cover it up, and I'll glue all the way down to the bottom of this just to make sure it's nice and secure. Okay, so I have already cut these pieces to length, and so it looks good length on both sides. And in theory, whatever this is, this one should follow, but sometimes it's a little bit off, especially if you get into larger dimensions. But labeling, so I've labeled on both locations here and there, so I know all that's going to be good. The next step here is that I need to true up one end and then align for what's going to be the second cut. So keeping in my sequence, start over here, make my cut, slide it over here, but I need to measure first. So let me make this cut, and then we'll talk about where I need to go next. That looks pretty good. So whenever we do miters, this first corner is always going to look pristine, which is perfect. But I now need to measure where the second position is, and I always prefer not breaking out some type of a measuring device, but I can do, pardon me, I can get a measurement off of the projection of this outside piece, and that'll give me a line exactly where I want to cut this. It's super helpful if you throw the pieces around while you're making your cuts. All right, so transferring that around, getting rid of that. So, in preparation of making this cut, I want to set this up so that I'm not cutting right on the line. I would much rather cut this thing long and then inch up on it. And underscoring a situation you'd run into here with this design, I have this little block in this position to keep these things nice and stable and rigid. If you didn't have this and you didn't want to use this type of a system for clamping, you can just clamp across these areas, but because this is in place, I just can't get a clamp in this area. So I need to be able to get this thing, get this piece put where I want it to go without interfering with this. So I've done this, and I'm going to cut this a little bit long. By a little bit long, I'm talking about maybe a 1/16 of an inch. It's always easier to cut more off, right? So yeah, there's that. And that looks pretty close. All right, see how it goes. Still too long, which is great. So to my left over here, those corners align, and that's where I want it. I've got maybe a 1/16 of an inch, probably a little bit less, to trim off of this. So doing this thing here, I'm looking at the gap. Oops. Looking at the gap right here, so I'm going to pull this thing away a bit. Try to match exactly what I'm missing on the other side. Slide this thing over. See how this goes. is awfully close. Oops, I'm going to call that perfect. You have to take my word. I know I can't show this to you where I want to be, but that's pretty great. Okay, so I like that. Before I cut the other end, I need to check this one to make sure that this lines up there as well, and it looks like it will. All right, so this position will work for both ends, and then we're ready to go. Okay, hopefully that was helpful. I'm going to do the same for the lid as well, and hopefully that was helpful. I encourage everybody to make sleds if you haven't gotten into the habit of doing so by now, but it saves you a ton of time and a ton of commitment.